Thought they called an eyesore, a messy row of shrubs that, in quote, ruined the aesthetic harmony, in quote, of our little slice of suburban heaven. But what they didn't in Oppos, T realized, was that they weren't in Oppos. T just tearing out a hedge. They were opening a gate to a chaos they couldn't in Oppos. T possibly imagine. A 2,000-pound problem on 4 legs that didn't in Oppos. T give a damn about property values or neighborhood bylaws. See, I've lived on the edge of Blackwood Ridge for nearly 30 years, long before the developers arrived with their cookie-cutter blueprints and their obsession with manicured lawns. And back then, this land belonged to my grandfather, a man who understood that you don in Oppos. T fight the mountain, you negotiate with it. He planted that hedge, a massive, tangled wall of ancient cedar, yew, and thick mountain laurel. Not because he wanted privacy from neighbors who didn't in Oppos T exist yet, but because he knew the rhythms of the woods, and he knew that every winter the great Roosevelt elk moved through this corridor like ghosts in the fog. The hedge was a silent agreement, a living boundary that kept the wild where it belonged and kept us safe in our beds. But then came Brenda Vance, the kind of woman who treats a homeowners association presidency like she's commanding a small nuclear state. Brenda moved here 3 years ago from a high-rise in Chicago, bringing with her a clipboard, a ruler for measuring grass height, and a deep-seated hatred for anything she couldn't into Oppos. T-control, and my hedge just happened to be the one thing that stood between her backyard and the, in quote, perfect sunset view, in quote, she felt entitled to. It started with the letters, those passive-aggressive, cream-colored envelopes with the HOA logo that talked about, in quote, non-compliant vegetative structures, in quote, and, in quote, Section 8.2 of the Aesthetics Code, end quote, demanding I trim my grandfather in Oppos' legacy down to a measly 42 inches. I try to be the bigger person, I really did, so I invited the HOA's young property liaison, a kid named Tyler who looked like he'd never stepped off a sidewalk in his life, to come out to the barn so I could show him why that hedge mattered. I pointed out the deep tracks in the mud, the way the branches were rubbed smooth by antlers, and I told him flat out, end quote, Tyler, you cut this down, and you're taking away the only map these elk have. They don in Oppos, TC fences, they see paths, and if you take away the path, they're going to make a new one, right through your living room. End quote. The kid just smirked, adjusted his glasses, and told me that, end quote, wildlife displacement ISN in Oppos, a recognized zoning exemption, end quote, and that if I didn't in Oppos, comply by Friday, the board wouldn't, quote, remedy the situation, end quote. At my expense. I showed up to the next board meeting with maps, satellite imagery, and a letter from a retired state biologist who'd tracked this herd since the 80s. But Brenda didn't in Oppos. To even look at the papers, she just sipped her sparkling water and told the room that my, end quote, shrubbery, end quote, was devaluing the community and harborists. Her word, not mine. Dangerous pests. I stood there looking at these people who'd lived here for 5 minutes, and I felt this cold realization sink in that they weren't into Oppos. Just arrogant. They were dangerously ignorant, so I told them, end quote. Fine, you want the view? You're going to get a front row seat to something you'll never forget, but don and Oppos. You dare call me when the bill comes due, end quote. The machines arrived on a Tuesday morning, a low, mechanical growl that vibrated right through the floorboards of my barn, and when I stepped out, I saw Brenda standing there in her designer hiking boots, pointing at the hedge like she was a general surveying a battlefield. She'd hired a cut-rate landscaping crew who didn't end Oppos. Know a cedar from a telephone pole, and before I could even get my phone out to record, the skid steer lunged forward, teeth biting into the wood my grandfather had planted with his own 2 mow. It was sickening to watch, the sound of 100 years of growth snapping and splintering, birds screaming as they lost their nesting spots, and squirrels leaping for their lives. But Brenda just stood there, snapping photos for the neighborhood newsletter, looking absolutely triumphant. They tore out a 40-foot section right at the bend where the trail was the narrowest, leaving a gaping, raw wound in the landscape. And then she had the nerve to walk over to me, adjust her sunglasses, and say, end quote, there, doesn't Oppos, that feel more open? You should thank us, Elias. It really lets the light in. End quote. I didn't in Oppos. Say a word. I just looked past her at the darkening tree line, knowing that the sun was setting on the only thing keeping the peace in Blackwood Ridge, and that night, for the first time in 3 decades, I didn't in Oppos. Sleep. I just sat on my porch with a thermos of coffee, watching the gap. Around 2 in the morning, the wind shifted, carrying that heavy, musky scent of wet fur and wildness. And then I heard it, the first snap of a hoof on a broken branch, followed by a low, vibrating grunt that made the hair on my neck stand up. A massive bull elk, a brute with a rack that looked like a fallen oak tree, stepped out of the shadows and paused at the edge of the clearing, his ears twitching as he stared at the space where the hedge used to be. He was confused, his internal compass spinning, and behind him, 30 more shadows emerged from the pines, a sea of massive bodies shifting and murmuring in the dark. And when the lead bull finally stepped forward, he didn't end Oppos. Head back to the woods. He turned right toward the paved streets of the subdivision. The first casualty was the HOA's, signature entryway, a $30,000 stone monument with a cascading waterfall and imported lilies, which the herd decided was a perfect watering hole, and a very expensive salad bar. I followed them at a distance, filming everything on my phone, watching as these 2,000-pound animals wandered through the cul-de-sacs like they owned the place, their hooves clattering on the asphalt like a slow-motion cavalry charge. They moved into Brenda's backyard first, since she'd been so eager for the open view, and within 10 minutes, her prize-winning rose garden was nothing but mud and stems, and her custom-built cedar gazebo was leaning at a 45-degree angle after a curious cow elk decided to use the corner post as a scratching post. But the real show started at dawn, when the neighborhood actually woke up to find their perfect world had been reclaimed by the wild, and the screams started echoing through the valley. I saw Brenda's neighbor, a guy who spent every Saturday polishing his black BMW, come running out of his bathrobe only to freeze mid-step because there was a 5-point bull standing on his driveway, staring him down with eyes that didn't end Oppos. Know what a car was, only that it was in the way. The bull didn't end Oppos. Charred, he just lowered his head and gave the driver an Oppos. S-side door a gentle nudge with his GAC, leaving a jagged silver streak through the paint that probably cost more than my tractor, and the guy just sat down on his front step and started crying. By noon, the HOA's private Facebook group was a war zone of panic and finger-pointing, with people posting videos of elk grazing on their porch swings and, depositing, massive piles of evidence on their manicured lawns, and Brenda, bless her heart, was frantically calling the sheriff, demanding that the nuisance animals, be arrested or removed. The sheriff, a local boy who'd grown up hunting these ridges, told her flat out that he wasn't in Oppos. About to start a shootout with a protected migratory herd just because they were trespassing, on a golf course, and that she should have thought about that before she destroyed the only barrier they had. The emergency board meeting that night was held in the community center, but half the members couldn't and Oppos to even get there because a group of cows and calves had decided to take a nap right in the middle of the main intersection. So the meeting happened over a chaotic Zoom call instead. Brenda looked like she hadn't and Oppos. Slept in a week, her hair a mess, her voice cracking as she tried to blame me for, baiting, the animals, but I just logged on, shared my screen, and played the video of the skid steer tearing out the hedge while she cheered. You wanted the view, Brenda, I said, my voice calm while the rest of them were screaming, and now you've got it. Every single one of those animals is currently enjoying the view of your backyard, and according to the State Wildlife Bureau, since you're the one who altered the migratory path, you might just be liable for every cent of the damage, The silence that followed was the sweetest thing I've ever heard, broken only by the sound of someone's dog barking at an elk through a window in the background, and that's when the lawsuits started flying. Not at me, but at the HOA board for gross negligence and willful destruction of a protective ecological buffer. Within a month, Brenda's, sunset view, had cost the association nearly $500,000 in insurance claims, repairs, and legal fees, and the, unapproved vegetative structure, she hated so much was suddenly the only thing everyone wanted back. It took a while, but the reckoning finally came when the state environmental agency, stepped in and slapped the HOA with a massive fine for interfering with a protected wildlife corridor, and the board, desperate to save their own skins, voted unanimously to remove Brenda from her position and appoint a new committee. The new president, a retired schoolteacher who actually knew how to listen, came to my porch with a literal olive branch and a check to cover the cost of replanting the entire hedge line with the biggest, thorniest, most, in quote, non-compliant, in quote, bushes we could find. I spent the next 3 weeks out there with my neighbors, people I'd never spoken to before, digging holes and planting new life into the earth, and it was strange to see them, the same people who'd complained about my, in quote, overgrown weeds, in quote, now carefully tucking saplings into the ground like they were protecting a holy site. We didn't in Oppos. T just rebuild a hedge. We build a new understanding of what it means to live on the edge of the world. And while the elk still pass through every winter, they stay behind the line now, their shadows moving quietly past the barn while the neighborhood sleeps in a peace they finally learned to earn. Brenda ended up moving away a few months later. Her house sat on the market for ages because word got out about the, in quote, elk magnet, in quote, in the backyard. And the last time I saw her, she was packing her car, looking at the ridge with a look of pure, unadulterated hatred. But the mountain didn't end Oppos. T care, and neither did the elk. Now, when I sit on my porch and watch the sun dip below the thick, green wall of the new hedge, I think about how fragile our sense of control really is, and how quickly the things we try to tame can turn around and remind us who really owns the land. But here's the thing that still gets people talking around here. Some folks say I planned the whole thing, that I knew exactly what would happen and I let it happen just to teach them a lesson, while others say the HOA was just doing its job, and that, in quote, wild animals, in quote, shoot in Oppos. T dictate how modern neighborhood is run. So I have to ask you, if you were in my shoes, watching your legacy be destroyed by people who didn't in Oppos, T understand the ground they stood on, would you have fought harder to stop the machines? Or would you have stepped back and let the wild do the talking for you? Is it our job to protect the neighbors from their own ignorance? Or is some destruction necessary to make people finally see the truth? Drop a comment below and let me know whose side you're on, the man with the hedge or the woman with the view, and Don and Oppos. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button for more stories from the edge of the ridge, because out here, the land always has the last word.